Right.
And you will be recording it. Hello, everybody. Hope you all can hear me. Um, Welcome to this session of the ISCO UK Meetup. These sessions are brought to you by the ISCO UK Meetup Committee. ISCO is a membership organisation. The ISCO UK website holds the repository of all previous UK ISCO events, along with details on membership benefits and how to join. The ISCO site also has upcoming events and other relevant seminars and conferences. During the presentation, your mics will be muted. Please add your questions at the end of the presentation in the chat box, and they will be answered by our speaker today. The entire session will be recorded and made available via the ISCO UK website later. Please leave any feedback on the Meetup site, the Knowledge Organisation London Public Group in comments section. And let us know if you would like to present a talk in the ISCO meetups. This is for everyone, students, researchers, expert, anyone in the KO area. So I just need to bring it down. On behalf of the ISCO Meetup Committee, I have the pleasure to introduce Paul Rissen. Paul is the Senior Product Manager for Magazines and Content Solutions at Springer Nature. Paul spent 10 years as an information architect and product manager at Siemens and the BBC before moving to Springer Nature in 2016. I hand it to you, Paul. Thank you.
Hello, hopefully that has unmuted me. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Rissen. I should probably start by apologising for the mess behind me. I am in the process of moving, and so everything is in boxes, and I've also spent pretty much all day at my old place packing stuff up. So yes, apologies for all that. Right, if I share my screen, hopefully this will get started. Okay. Somebody let me know if you can't see my screen, Arif maybe, but hopefully everyone should be able to see.
Yes, we can see.
Great. Okay. In which case, I'll get started. So first of all, thank you very much to the ISCO committee for inviting me to speak today. I want to just take you through some work that I've done over the years and some things I've learnt all around what I call the kind of the information architecture of narrative and storytelling. I've called this Beyond the Hero's Journey because often when people talk about what is storytelling and how do you go about telling stories, they either just say, well, there's a beginning, middle and end, or the most common thing you get is kind of the hero's journey, which is a common pattern for storytelling, but it is not the be all and end all. It's not the only way to tell stories. And if nothing else, it's actually a kind of framework that has been applied to explain existing stories rather than a framework that you have to use to tell stories. Anyway, so I shall go through a kind of summary of different projects I've worked on and some techniques and things I've picked up during the years. Yeah, hopefully it'll be interesting to everyone. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, introduction, here we go. Cool, so hello, I'm Paul. I am a senior product manager at Springer Nature, who are the publishers of the Nature Journal, but also 3,000 other scientific and academic journals. I spent about 10 years at the BBC. I recognise some names in the participants list, so hello to people I know. Whilst I was at the BBC, I co-wrote a manifesto for structured journalism, partly based on what I'm going to talk about today. I joined Springer Nature in 2016 and I worked for a year and a half on a machine learning recommendation product for recommending scientific and academic literature. I have been a product manager for Springer Nature's journal platform, so managing over 3,000 journal sites. And until last week, I was the product manager for Nature Briefing, which is Nature's daily newsletter, keeping people up to date with what's going on in the world of science. And that has just expanded to take on all of Nature's what they call front half, so journalism, news, comment, opinion, everything apart from the academic papers side of it. So I'm looking forward to getting involved in that. And yes, at the BBC, I spent several years doing digital storytelling prototypes. I'm a big Doctor Who fan, a big fan of Chelsea FC, who are due to play at 8 o'clock, so I will make sure I'm finished before then. And as you'll guess, a storytelling structure nerd. So, where to start? So one thing during the process of all the research and working on this is I've come up with a kind of 3-layer architecture of narrative, probably influenced by what I learned from technology of kind of 3-layer systems. But yeah, what I like to break it down to is the story world, the storytelling, which sits on top of the story world, and then story knowledge. To explain that a bit more, so going from the top, story knowledge is how much the audience knows about the past or the current state of a story. So obviously by the end of being told a story, you know pretty much everything that's happened in the story world. Or maybe there's still some gaps, and then that's left for you to fill in as you wish. But that story knowledge layer is how much the audience knows. Storytelling, therefore, is a process of revealing selected elements of the story world. So, and I'll go into this in more detail later, but telling is all about revealing different parts of that story world and communicating it to the audience. And so the story world is the objects within the world of the story and the connections and how they change between them. This is very much influenced by the domain-driven design approach, which I guess a few of you are familiar with. So taking that kind of object modeling and relationship modeling approach to the world of the story, and then kind of going on from that. So one of the first projects that I got to explore this on was a prototype in 2009-10 called the Mythology Engine. So this was inspired by, at the BBC, there is a /program, so bbc.co.uk/programs. And that was all based on the ideas of linked data and the semantic web. Actually, you should have a URI for every program. So for every episode of every show that's ever been broadcast by the BBC, there should be a page and a URI. I worked on that project for a couple of years. And whilst working on it, I was like, okay, well, we have a page for an episode, but when I sit down to watch an episode of Doctor Who, I don't really care anymore about that it's on BBC One or what time it starts. What I care about is what happens in the story. So why not have a page for every significant story event, every character, and then the way that those web pages, those URIs are linked represents what happens in the story. So characters who are related should be linked. Events that influence other events should be linked. So in doing this, I came up with a basic data model, domain model for storytelling, or at least for plot events and modeling, all that kind of thing. And with the help of the BBC R&D team, we built a little prototype. We put Doctor Who stuff in there. We also put EastEnders stuff in there because the idea is that this should be a reusable platform for, at this point, drama. So here you're looking at a story page. Now this is different from a program page because in the kind of the broadcast world, this story was told over 2 different episodes. But from a pure story point of view, it's one page, it's one thing. So you've got the timeline of what happens in the story. With each of those little boxes there, you could click to visit a page for each event. We've got synopsis, you could see the characters involved in each event and what they did. There is that kind of good and evil characters thing, which is probably a little simplistic, but we wanted to get started somewhere. But yeah, you've got stories at the top, you can see the tabs, characters, places, things was just anything else. So objects, stuff like that. Sonic screwdriver, TARDIS, things like that. So this was, a prototype platform which you could, the idea is, just as with Slash programs, you could pour any program information into it. You could basically, straight from the scripts, straight from the people actually creating the stories, they could pour this data in and you'd have a ready-made program website which goes into the stories. One thing that I really like, which we did, was, so this event that I've highlighted here is an event where Sarah Jane Smith, who was a companion of the Doctor in the 1970s stories, comes face to face with an old adversary. So we're showing you what happens in the 2009 episode, but over on the left here, you'll see that in the dialogue, they refer to events from a past episode. So what we did is we made a link to it. Now, this wouldn't really happen on a program page because there is nothing in the data, in the purely broadcast transmission data, which tells you that these two episodes, one from the 70s, one from 2009, were linked. Crucially, that's in the story, it's in the dialogue. So we've linked to a clip straight from the 70s. And in fact, this clip itself refers to something from the 60s. So piece by piece, you build up essentially a web of story, a web of information about the story. Kind of similar, I suppose, to, and this was 2009, 2010. So aside from Wikipedia, there weren't really the kind of the whole fandom wikis haven't really been born yet. But this is the kind of similar thing. And the same idea is that you know, if the BBC were to do this, this would become like the official information. It wouldn't go too far, so it wouldn't stop fans from doing stuff themselves, but it was a starting point. And crucially, these were URIs that anyone could then link to and refer to, very much in the spirit of linked data as well. So we started with Doctor Who in EastEnders, and then a few years down the line, we were contacted by the team from The Archers. So The Archers is the world's longest running radio soap opera, I believe, in the world. It's been going since the very early days of the BBC. And the team, who are based in Birmingham, until, well, this is now probably about 10 years ago, the way they kept a track of what had happened in all the stories is they had this massive index card file of everything. So you can see here, you've got a clump of index cards for a particular character. Now here it's got those kind of more biographical details, but pretty much all the other cards in that stack, excuse me, are a list of events and who was involved and what happened. So what we were able to do was, well, just before we came across this, the Archers team had been transferring all of this into an Access database, Microsoft Access database. We were able to extract that information and, using the Mythology Engine platform, provide a web front end for it, which made it so much easier for the scriptwriters and everyone to keep a track of what's going on. The scriptwriters could actually use this as a resource. So, you know, when they're trying to think of what's going to happen in next week's episode, they can check, oh, whose birthday is coming up? We can refer to that in dialogue. And I have been told, even though I left the BBC a while ago, I have been told that in the past year with the pandemic, that web front end, that repository of information, was one of the things that kept the Archers on the air, because people working from home were able to refer to all of this information. So yeah, that's quite an achievement, which I'm quite pleased with. So we did the mythology engine first. Then we found this treasure trove of information from the Archers, and then we went to BBC Monitoring. BBC Monitoring, for those of you who don't know, was a kind of joint project between the BBC and the government to monitor foreign news networks. And we went there and we discovered pretty much exactly the same thing, but not for fictional people, for real people. So here is one of the index cards for Nelson Mandela. And it's the same data structure, it's the same format. So even though we'd started with fiction, there is nothing to stop you doing the same thing for news, for sport, for any kind of story that you're talking about. So yeah, this was all very encouraging. Potentially we could use the same data models, same format, same platform to power any kind of storytelling experience at BBC. So now I want to kind of dive down a little bit more into the theory of storytelling, and some of the things that I've discovered in my research and found out about. So the first one is those narrative events, so the things that happen in the world of the story. So a way to think about it is some events are what are known as kernels. So these are key events which shape the whole plot. These are the turning points, because lots of things happen in the story, but some of them are only kind of incidental. Some of them are just kind of character, filling in a little bit more, what's their favorite color, or that kind of thing. Whereas the kernels, those are the key plot points that you need to know. And then satellites are those more incidental things. Now the crucial point here is that the audience don't know which events are kernels and which ones are satellites. So as a scriptwriter, as a storyteller, you can play around with this. You could seed something which, to all intents and purposes, in one particular story, an episode, could just seem like a satellite. And then a few episodes later, a few films later, actually that turns out to be one of the most crucial things that has happened in the whole story. You see this a lot with kind of the rise of on-demand or DVD or cinematic universes. People are much more able to go back and rewatch, and they get a lot more value from noticing things that happened in the past. So this is quite a nice little framework to think about when you're coming up with a story. As a storyteller, as a writer, which things are the kernels, which things are the satellites, and which things are you disguising? So going on to storytelling. So I've come up with this definition myself. It's not official or anything, but I quite like it. Storytelling, excuse me, I would say is the revelation of connected information over time. So if we think back to the story world is all the characters, all the plot events, all the places, the locations. And those are all linked. There is a web of story objects which just exist in this fictional universe. Storytelling, therefore, is the writer, the director, leading the audience through a path through that web. It's kind of the equivalent of a user journey, basically, through a website. It's a particular path. But of course, if you have built something as a website where you've got all of that story web hyperlinked, then although the first pass people may go through on this particular story journey with you, then they can explore those other connections later. But yeah, if I had to sum up what I feel storytelling is, it is the gradual revelation of that connected information. So by connected information, I mean that it's hard to, nobody really cares about a particular individual character. What they care about is whether that character has a fight with another character. It's the relationships between the things that actually matter, the semantic relationships. So that connected information. And I say over time because it's the order in which you reveal that information which is crucial. I'm obviously not the first, nor not by a long shot, to come up with something around this. Similar terms were coined by Vladimir Prop, I believe in the early 1900s. There we go. Fabula. This is the raw material of the story. So this is kind of akin to the story world. It's also like everything that happened in chronological order. But not all stories are told in chronological order. So he coined another term, suiset, I believe it's pronounced, which is the way the story is organized. So commonly you'll have flashbacks, or you'll come in media res, say in the middle of the story. The storytelling, the narrative order it can be a very different thing to the chronological order. However, with a sporting event or with the news, you can't avoid most things being chronological order, but it's not always that way. A former colleague of mine, Michael Smethurst, kind of illustrated this very well in terms of murder mystery plots. So I'm trying to work, one of these is Columbo, and the other is Midsummer Murders. I believe this one is Columbo, in that the way the story is told is pretty much chronological. So you start by following the killer. You see their motive, how they do it, the murder, and then you're watching Columbo, the investigator, solve the crime. Whereas a murder mystery like Midsummer Murders in the UK, the audience comes in at the moment of the murder. They're kind of piggybacking on the investigation themselves. And so you only really find out by kind of flashbacks why somebody did it, all of that kind of thing. So this is quite a nice little way to think about. The fabula is that top one, how things actually happened in the world, and the suiset is the way that they were revealed to the audience. Building on that, I'd say there's kind of three kinds of story time. So there's the story time. So this is kind of the fabula. This is the chronological order. So the time as it took place in the world of the story. The second one is the discourse time. So I believe actually Jason Mittell, this scholar, came up with these terminology. And in fact, do I have a book with me? No, don't have it to hand. Jason Mittell wrote a very good book around this called Complex TV. I would recommend. Discourse time, so this is the narrative order, the order of events as they're told to the audience. And finally, there's narration time. So this is the amount of time that it takes to experience the story. So in some cases, you hear or you listen, you get the whole of the story in one go, but not always. So if you're reading a book, you may read a few chapters at a time, then come back to it a week later. If you're thinking of a kind of episodic narrative where there's one show every week, then the narration time is very different. If you're talking about cinema, it could be years. And crucially, this experience time leaves gaps, and it's gaps in which the audience can fill in or can speculate about what's going to happen next. The more condensed the narration time, the less chance there is for the audience to kind of almost play a part in experiencing the story of speculating on what's going to happen. So yeah, three different kinds of time, each of which have a different influence on the way you tell the story, and crucially on what people know. So if you were to just reveal everything in chronological order in one sitting, it's a fairly straightforward story. You'll achieve certain effects, or you could play around with the order in which you reveal things. You'll achieve different effects. This is this is something I think which has really fascinated me, is less about 3-act structures or the hero's journey, but more about what are the techniques that storytellers use to achieve certain effects in the audience. Because they, why do people use flashbacks? They do it to achieve a certain effect, to make somebody realize that, to give somebody a certain experience. So these are the kinds of things that I'm really interested in. So just talking a little bit more about narration time. Another aspect of that is not only the length of time over which the story is told, but if you're talking about a series, the kind of format of the story. So this is a spectrum. On the left side, you've got what's known as anthology, or slightly confusingly, episodic stories. So these are things where each episode, each contained unit of story is essentially separate. They may share, across all these episodes, they may share a common story world, or there may be characters that reappear or things that are referenced again and again, but each story unit is kind of self-contained. So if you think about anthology series, so something like True Detective, each series was kind of seen as its own unit of story. There were episodes within that, but at the end of the series, you'd reach the end of that story. There may be references in future series, and gradually it builds up this whole wider world. But the anthology and the episodic way of telling stories is, I would say it's almost like a more subtle way of telling a story. It's more about the world building. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got serial storytelling. And this is a much more straightforward, right, we're going to tell a single story in 6 episodes, and there might be cliffhangers. The single story is going to continue over those 6 episodes. Or if you think about, I suppose, the common format for a book, a fiction book, each episode is a chapter, but it's a single story told over all of them. And of course, this isn't an either or. The reason it's a spectrum is you can be somewhere in the middle here. So True Detective actually is a really good example of something which is kind of in between. So each series is standalone, but within the series, you've got a serial narrative. If you think of things like Doctor Who or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, again, they're kind of in the middle there. And this kind of aspect of blurring the boundaries between the two is exactly what Jason Littell calls complex television. It's a thing that he identified came very much to the fore in the 90s and early 2000s, very much influenced by changing production styles, changing technology, the ability to rewind and watch again, that kind of thing. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that book. So now let's move on to story knowledge. So we've started with the story world, that is the things in the world of the story, the plot events, the characters. We've talked about storytelling, so that's the order in which you reveal elements of the story world. The story knowledge, so this is about primarily what the audience know. So through storytelling, you are granting knowledge to the audience, or you're declining to give them certain pieces of knowledge for certain reasons. There we go. There's the 3-layer architecture again. So I'd been thinking about this for a while, and independently and from much more experience of actually producing dramas, John York, who was the former controller of BBC drama production, wrote a really good book called Into the Woods, in which he says storytelling is the dramatization of the process of knowledge assimilation, which is kind of similar to my definition of storytelling. But what I like here especially is it's talking about knowledge assimilation. And that actually got me thinking, it's not just about what the audience knows, but what each of the characters knows at any one point in time. And this dramatization of who knows what and what they don't know and what they do know at certain points in time. And this leads us on to how you can use events in particular ways. So there's this idea of narrative statements and narrative enigmas. So narrative statements are pretty clear, cut and dried. Narrative statements, you just say, okay, this character exists, this thing happens. There's not really much to speculate on. You're given everything that happens. What these tend to do, these events, is they set the constraints. So it's what's undeniable. This is fact in the world of the story. It happened. Of course, there could be manipulations of this. Something could be presented as fact and then revealed later to be a complete sham. But the statement is where something is very clearly established, and that's it. There's no mystery around it. The information is revealed. On the other hand, you have narrative enigmas. So these are things where you haven't been told what's happened, or you've only witnessed kind of the aftermath. So if you think of a story where, you know, you're talking about somebody who is 40, 50 years old, and there is some oblique reference to something that happened in their childhood, but you never see that event in the story. It happened in the story world. It exists as a thing that we could link to, that we could access, but it's a kind of narrative enigma. What happened? Why did it happen? And storytellers use these deliberately to incite that intrigue. There's a really good way that these are used, is that narrative statements create kind of tension, because if you think about how you watch horror films, so you as the audience know more, you get to see what's actually happening more than the characters do. So there's this kind of build up of tension because you know more than they. So you're like watching out for, there's no surprise for you as an audience. It's more tense. You're waiting for them the characters to react. Whereas mysteries make much more use of narrative enigmas. So these might be where the characters have more knowledge than the audience. So the audience is left speculating on what's going on. So yeah, those are the two kind of ways in which you could use events, again, to create different effects. So narrative statements, excuse me, these lead to what's known as anticipation hypotheses. So you state something as a fact, and this leads to speculation of what might happen next. It's forward facing. There's no real speculation about what happened in the past. It's just what's going to happen next. Now you could say that this is a common model for news, right? Something happens in the world, and there is then a lot of speculation over what are the consequences, what's it going to mean, what's going to happen next. These are used to set or subvert expectations. So you can set expectations by saying, oh, this happened. You could subvert it by suddenly saying, actually, no, the real truth is this. And given that new information, what's going to happen next? So yeah, it gets audiences thinking about the future. And encourages the sharing of ideas. So the sharing of that speculation over what might happen next. New fiction, fan fiction based on this. Narrative enigmas lead to curiosity hypotheses. How did we get here? They encourage people to go back into history, be that fictional or real, and encourage what's known as forensic fandom, forensic examination. So, how on earth did Manchester City run away with the league at some point? So people will go back to try and find the moment when, oh, well, this player got sent off. So that's the moment where the whole season changed. It's all about trying to make sense of what's revealed. Again, this works for news. So the pandemic. Let's go and try and go back and find out how did it first start. Let's do a whole investigation over where it started, how it started. These are curiosity hypotheses. Ooh, I can see something in the chat. Oh dear, I didn't want to know about Chelsea. Let me go back to that. I've talked about the difference in knowledge between the characters and the audience, but really this is kind of a triangle, and it's all about the asymmetry of knowledge. So the storyteller, the character, and the audiences, they will all have different states of knowledge. And although I've said storytelling is all about the revelation of that connected information, the drama is all in the disparity of knowledge between these three elements. So from storyteller to audience, this is your classic thing where the storyteller will start off knowing more than the audience and will gradually reveal things. Character to character. So there should be a loop here, I guess. Character to character, so, some characters are more informed than other characters. The murderer knows more than the detective, and will perhaps spill the beans at some point. Character to audience. So again, that kind of example of horror. So the character knows less than the audience knows at any one point in time. Audience to character. So again, the reverse of that. The audience knows more, knows less. Audience to audience. So this is where you get things like spoilers. So certain sections of an audience may know more than other sections of the audience at any one time. They may have skipped ahead, or some may have fallen behind. This is also where you get fan fiction, so people coming up with new stories that they share amongst the audience. Audience to storyteller is an evolution of that fan fiction. So you think that in traditional stories, the storyteller has all the power, right? They tell the story to the audience, and it's a one-way relationship. But actually what we see now more and more is the audience are coming up with their own versions of the story, or they're demanding certain pairings between, there should be a relationship between these two characters, and they feed that back, sometimes quite venomously, to the storyteller, or they could do it more altruistically, I'm sure. But again, we have this relationship the other way. So it's not just a one-way channel of storyteller to audience. It can go the other way. But crucially, it's all about this asymmetry of knowledge. Who knows more, who thinks they know more about any certain event or the state of play at any one point in time. So I've really covered there the three-level architecture: the story world, the storytelling, the story knowledge. The final thing I want to touch on is, okay, so how do we use this? How do we actually make stories, particularly in this digital, the era of linked data and semantic web and just web architecture in general? So story making. So worth saying, again, I'm not the first to work on this or come up with any of these things. So Adrian Holovati, Steen de Brouwer, there are lots of people, particularly in the world of structured journalism, who've been thinking about this from a metadata point of view, from a domain modeling point of view, from a tagging point of view for a long time. And there's lots you can read about this. So this was our attempt to come up with a basic structure, a model for stories. So there are stories and there are events. Now, crucially, these are not the same thing. So an event can happen in the world, but many stories could be told about that same event. You could tell hundreds of stories about the sinking of the Titanic, some of which will include events that happened. Some will have it in different orders. Some will make up other events. So events exist in the world, and then stories, lots of different stories are told about those events. The story itself, at its most basic, is made up of a list of events in a particular order. Now, the reason that the slots represent the order in which they are told, and the events can be pulled into and can be included in that list of events. And this allows you to tell things non-chronologically. So it doesn't dictate that events have to be in a certain order, in a certain kind of chronological order. The slots allow you to tell things in different orders. So that's a basic model for story making. And this is what we use quite a while back now. Again, BBC example, BBC history, the Battle of Britain. So the Battle of Britain, this page, this is a story. It's a story about an event that happened, but it's a story which contains different events. So these are the key events that were chosen to make up the story. And so each of these has a page. Each of these has a page. Each of those is an event in the story. But then, and it's in a particular order. So they could have been, there were lots more things that happened in the Battle of Britain. You could decide to tell a story of the Battle of Britain, which is literally just the 2 days, 3 days where it happened. But this, they chose to tell more of the background to it as well. One thing that was really interesting in the history side of it was it's not just about the events, but it's how people interpret it. So extending the model on slightly further, each event in the story can be interpreted in many different ways. And you see this, in the world of news and journalism, something happens in the world and people interpret it in very different ways. It happens in drama as well. And interpretations can make a set of claims. So, you might think of this set of statements, and those claims ideally should be backed up by sources, by evidence. And again, this is starting to explore a web of story backed up by evidence and sources, which you could then use to, fact check things. Or maybe it's not, maybe you want to delight in the multiplicity of different interpretations. Maybe that's the thing about it. Maybe you would say that, okay, in this model, fan fiction can have a space where people will interpret different events. And they, I, a fan, can make a claim, and I can say, well, my source is this episode of Doctor Who. But Stephen Moffat, who wrote an episode, has his own interpretation, and that would probably have more weight because he actually wrote it. So yeah, there's kind of this model allows for different interpretations, and then with an idea of kind of similar to Google's link weight, that the more people who agree with certain interpretation, that would be represented. It wouldn't necessarily remove other ones because you want to allow people to express themselves. However, but naturally more things, whether that's by popularity or whether it's by the weight or the trustworthiness of the source, you could start to do all that kind of thing. And this, I think, is a really underutilized part of journalism. So journalism still today is very much, and arguably drama and sport, is very much in the world of we film something or we record something or we write about something, we just put the article online. That's not actually the news. Those are artifacts, those are renditions of story. They are particular media representations of story. But actually, like I said before, when I sit down to watch a program, I don't care about that particular media representation. I care about what's going on in the story. And when it comes to the news, people don't talk about what they might share an article. Did you see that article? Really, what they're thinking of is what's in the article, what's going on in the world. Now, yes, there are, people will talk about journalists or the way something was presented, the interpretation. So that is possible as well. But yeah, there is much more to be dug into than just articles or clips or programs or just tagging. There's all this kind of wealth of story information to explore. So here we have a page for Churchill becomes Prime Minister, and you can see it features in the Battle of Britain. So this is a single event which is featured in this one story, but potentially this event could be in many stories. And you'd have like different strips of story, almost like military badges we designed. And that thing, the highlights from BBC programmes, those different interpretations of this event. So you've got different historians talking about how significant this event was in the Battle of Britain. Some people say Churchill becoming Prime Minister was really important. Others say, no, it didn't matter at all. It was, anyone could have been Prime Minister and the events would have played out the same way. So interpretations we started to build into this model as well. And here you've got the general things, the events, the who, the what, all, it's the same as the mythology engine, right? It's the same as the archers, but this is history. All of this led to what became the storyline ontology. So this was developed in association with The Guardian, the BBC, Press Association, and others to basically take the models that I've told you about already today and apply it to news, mainly for the point of tagging, but it's essentially the same model, and it should still be available, I hope. That was 2013. The next step was myself and former colleague Jackie Mayer wrote a manifesto for structured journalism, essentially to try and push BBC News beyond just doing tagging, and to try and encourage people to think in that way of the story world and the linked data and all of this kind of thing. This is sadly no longer available on the BBC News Labs website, but it is available on the Web Archive. So thank you very much to the Internet Archive for that. But yeah, if you want to get some sense of what I would love to do with journalism, you could read that. And hopefully I'll get a chance at some point in the future. It's not just the BBC have been doing this. So Vox Media have got a thing called story streams. So they have a story. In this case, I've chosen Chelsea, the redevelopment of their stadium. And they have events that happen within it. Yes, so the same kind of idea of events that take place along a storyline. So finally, to sum up, hopefully kind of you've got a taste of the models you could use to structure stories, the different techniques. So those different techniques that storytellers use to produce certain effects. And then where I think it's ultimately very vital and very interesting is in the world of news and journalism, particularly around those interpretations and claims, and I think we're crying out for different ways to design experiences around showing those interpretations. I think part of the problem really at the moment is you can only ever see one thing. It's impossible to get an overview of what's going on really, or see the links between them, or understand who's trustworthy and who isn't. So the key points to leave you with really. So yeah, I think the world of a story can be the basis for much more than just tagging. So rather than just tagging an article with a person or a journalist or an event, representing what's going on in the story as a web, as a system of URIs and hyperlinks, and allowing people to find their own paths around that, to traverse it. So yeah, you link the things together in a way that represents the story relationships. The order in which you reveal that information will be crucial to how the audience understand and experience the story. So as a storyteller, you can play around with that. You can shape that as much as you can, as much as you want. The time over which you tell that story will also shape the behavior and the reactions. So if you tell it on a slow burn, you leave a lot more time for speculation, for those curiosity hypotheses. Whereas if it's one shot, that effect only happens later. I would say personally, I feel it's kind of a truism that drama is conflict. I don't think that's actually true. I think that leads to a lot of kind of all stories must have aggression, fights and things like that. I don't think that's necessarily true, especially in the world of journalism. You get the kind of the two sides to every story. You must encourage fights between people. I think drama isn't necessarily conflict. It's the disparity of knowledge. It's who knows more than who, and how do people try to uncover knowledge. That's what drama is, the uncovering of that knowledge, and the fact that somebody knows more than somebody else. That's where the real tension in drama comes from. So yes, the asymmetry of knowledge between those various parties can be harnessed by you as a storyteller, or it can be exploited. So you may choose to hold certain things back. You know, you as a government, as a corporation, whoever, you may choose not to reveal certain things, but that then leads to speculation. So yeah, that asymmetry is really crucial, I feel. And finally, I think surfacing the different stories that people tell about events and the interpretations of those events, finding better ways to do that whilst maintaining trust and maintaining a semblance of reality, in fact, is really fertile ground for innovation. And it's something I hope excites people and interests people. And that, I believe, is everything. So yeah, hopefully that was useful and interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Amazing, really enlightening. Thank you. If anybody's got questions, if you would like to put them in the chat box, please.
Whilst we're waiting for people to type, Jonathan Engel has added a comment that he says, one of his journalism professors maintained that there is a good explanation for an event, and then there is the real explanation. Government ministers usually give the good explanation. The journalist's job is to discover the real explanation.
Yeah, that's nice. I like that. Are there any other questions?
If you would prefer to ask Paul in person, simply unmute yourself. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. And I'm really interested in how you put together the narrative from as a traditional, in many ways, to professional taxonomist. That's quite, just linking those things together, which I will think about when I'm reading something, when I'm watching drama, when I'm watching films, etc. But it's subconsciously, and you've done it very consciously and pulled it apart, put it together. I find that fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, there is a whole there is an academic field on this called cognitive poetics, I believe. So I would definitely encourage people who want to dive into the theory a bit more can explore cognitive poetics.
So we have some comments, just lots of thanks for a very fascinating talk. Do you have, there is one comment from Reza. Do you have any thoughts on how this model could be applied to a situation where you're not the originator of the story, i.e. a librarian cataloguing other people's information?
Yeah, that's a good point. I suppose my instinct there would be to essentially take the role of the historian. So you have a trove of information which has come from somewhere else, and as a librarian, you are choosing which things to include in an archive, or which order to experience them. I think that, yeah, it also comes down to the interpretations thing as well. So you'd want to make sure that there is a clear a clear acknowledgement, clear signposting, saying, okay, well, these are the things that happened, and then this is my interpretation of how it all fits together. And that kind of expresses that thing where you're not the originator of the story, but you are picking a path through it. You are putting your interpretation, your spin on it as well.
Trying to unmute myself. How much do you think that actually influences the way people view events and the way they interpret them?
I think there is almost like it's at the moment it's all very implicit, which I think is one of the things I've been frustrated with kind of traditional media, I'll call it, is that a lot of the problems we suffer from today in the kind of news environment are because people implicitly get that thing about there are things in the world and different interpretations, but there is no easy way to explore that and to share it and to compare. It very easily just becomes a fight over the truth, or whose interpretation is better. There's no real way to explore and compare and contrast, other than in I'd actually say the kind of the fan community amongst dramas. Now that has its own problems as well. But yeah, I suppose my optimistic viewpoint here is that people do instinctively get this, but they don't necessarily have the model or the structure or the language or the way to experience it, the way to explore it, which would help make people more aware. It's maybe a silly example, but it's kind of similar to the whole unconscious bias thing. It's a thing that people do and it influences them, but they're not necessarily able to talk about it or express it.
Yeah, thank you. Simon says he's struggling to come up with a question rather. This is fascinating and thought-provoking stuff. But then he says, were there any unique challenges to implementing your model of stories in data, and what technologies have you used? So two really good questions.
So in terms of technology, I think you can be pretty simple about it. So obviously, like that data model, you could express in a relationship, a relational database, right? On the other side, you could fully implement a triple store if you wanted. So I think the technology you choose can be fairly agnostic. It's really just that model of way of thinking, and indeed, such programs, I would actually say, is kind of sometimes misunderstood as a linked data project. It wasn't built on a triple store. It was just basic how you do the web, URLs and hyperlinks. But you could receive that as HTML, or you could receive it as JSON, or you could receive it as RDF. So in terms of the technology, I think you can keep it pretty simple. In terms of challenges to implement the model, I think the main struggle was just the weight of history, the weight of investment in traditional forms of media, right? There are vast organizations all geared towards and invested in producing video and audio and text-based content. So adapting to a more information-based way of doing things is very difficult to justify in this era. I think that, again, it's this thing, like I was saying just before, about, again, I'm quite optimistic. I think journalists, scriptwriters, they do get this. They understand it's the kind of the natural thing, but because they're doing it naturally almost, it's then quite alien to try and explicitly do it through technology. So yeah, I think the main challenge has been just getting the chance to do more of it, really. I think also you do have to be careful. So it's not a perfect model. No model is perfect. And I think, particularly with the interpretations, this stuff is really powerful. So if you're going to do it for news, you kind of want to get it right if you're going to implement it properly, because it could go very horribly wrong. So which is why I've always felt that you do it with drama first. That can still go wrong, but at least it's fictional. You're not going to have like massive impacts on the real world. So yeah, I think there's challenges in that. Quite rightly, people are right to point out the flaws and the limitations of this way of thinking about storytelling. It's never going to be a perfect way, but it'll at least get us somewhere. And what I feel the challenge is to not let that hold you back, to at least try and see what comes out of it.
No, I think that's great attitude. There's a couple more. Guy Valerio has asked, has anybody created a storyline data in RDF, say, as structured input to machine learning based on past news events?
That is a very good question. I do not know, to be perfectly honest. So alas, I've not had... you'll notice that a lot of the projects that I talk about are from the early 2010s, mainly because that was the time that I was practically doing stuff at the BBC on it. Since leaving the BBC, Spring and HR, I've not yet had much chance to work on this kind of thing yet. So that's why I dove a bit more into the theory, the techniques there. I would love to play more around with this, and especially with the advent of machine learning, I think there's some interesting things you could do there. I think you have to be aware of the limitations of machine learning, that it's obviously still computers guessing things.
Yeah,
but I'm sure there's lots of interesting applications. But yeah, I don't have concrete examples, unfortunately.
Okay, Andrew Hain would like to know, are there some contemporary and historic storytellers that you find interesting?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I'm going to have to come back to that one, I think. Well, interestingly, so I believe actually, going back to one of the most ancient ones, I believe Plato talks about stories being a web of events that are likely or necessary. So, people have been thinking about stories as webs for quite a long time. Contemporary as well. Okay, so this is where my Doctor Who fandom. I would say that Stephen Moffat has been very good with playing around with these kind of techniques. Sometimes gets a little too baroque in it as well, but things like that. I mean, the whole of the kind of Marvel Cinematic Universe is really diving into this this world and this wealth of different ways of connecting stories. In fact, one of the main inspirations around this back in, again, the early 2010s was Marvel. Before they got into the whole cinematic universe, they actually released a whole load of story information as linked data. Peter Olson was the person who did that at Marvel. And so, yeah, he was way ahead of his time in doing it as well.
I did not know that. That's really interesting. I'm going to have to look it up now.
Yeah.
And a couple more questions. Rose wants to know, do you think it's impossible to ever be fully impartial then, with the relationship between the 3 points of the knowledge triangle always being uneven?
Personally, I think so. It's one thing I didn't say in my introduction is I studied history at university, and a lot of that has influenced me in terms of, I guess, although Aristotle was the person who talked about storytelling being a web, I believe. I suppose I don't subscribe to the Platonic view of there being like fully impartial things. It's all a matter of human interpretation. What you might see as an event, I may not see as an event. How I come up with stories will be different. And I think, yeah, maybe it is possible. Maybe it could be like a thing which is the weight of agreement. But even then, I don't think I would ever say something could be fully impartial. There's always going to be a risk that something is wrong. and again, that's both a hindrance, but also quite fertile, interesting ground to explore different interpretations of things. But acknowledging that impartiality is a bit of a utopia, I think, is important.
Right. And one final question, I think, so far from Mark, is one potential real world problem I can imagine occurring with journalism is that there is often a lot of nuance around the linkages between events, suspected involvement or alleged corruption. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how this model could be applied to grey areas, whether we can manifest the nuance in the relationships between entities in some way that a user will understand intuitively. That's a really long question.
That's okay. That's okay. I think this is where it really comes down to trust and the authority of the sources. I think there are. I wouldn't say I've got a solution to how to explore it necessarily, but I think there are interesting things to try here. So, you know, comparing what one news organization is saying against another and the weight of evidence that they're deploying for it. I think that, again, like acknowledging the nuance between linking events is really powerful. You know, right now, we don't acknowledge that. We just assume that there is this platonic truth, and then we fight over what's real. Whereas if we, you know, you could say that this is, you know, too postmodern and it gets into fake news and everything is of equal value and everything is true. I wouldn't say that. I think it's about, you know, you want to allow the possibility for there to be multiple interpretations, but going back to the historian in me, you still call back to actual evidence to give the weight of authenticity. That could be the weight of an organization or a particular journalist. Now, ultimately, this comes down to who the audience trust. But yeah, there's lots of nuance in there, I agree, and lots of room for exploration.
Thank you. Another comment from Jonathan. He says director Robert Altman angered him by changing the final event or ending in his film with Raymond Chandler's The Long Goodbye, but he used this device to show how the norms of the 40s no longer applied in the 70s.
Yeah, I suppose
I can understand why that could be done, but personally, I'm not sure I agree with doing it.
I think there's an interesting thing there about, you know, lots of popular stories get told in multiple times. So a remake of something, it won't be exactly the same unless they did a shot-for-shot remake. And so comparing different, like, I always use the example of Swallows and Amazons. So there's the book, there's been countless radio and TV adaptations. They're all telling the same stories. It's the same events, but they're expressed in so many different ways. So comparing them, you see the difference in storytelling and directing, which is really interesting to me.
Thank you. I think we're probably getting to out of time now. So Arif, do you have any final comments?
Yes, thank you, Paul. It was a fascinating speech. Thank you for your contribution. Just let our audience know our next meetup is on 25th of May, and our speakers are from Metataxis, and the title is MS Teams, the Case for Information Architecture and Governance. Thank you, everybody, for a fantastic job. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, and thanks, Paul.
Night. Thank you.
Paul.
Bye.